Hi, I'm Sera Markoff.
And I'm Michael Wise, and we're on the chopping block at visceralchange.org.
All right, everybody, we are back on the chopping block. Thank you all for tuning in as always in this brand new episode. We are here with some of my favorite people in the world, literally, because they are not in the United States as far as their profession goes, but they are sort of centered and based at the moment in the Netherlands. And so we are here with Sera Markoff and Michael Wise. Sera, you are a professor of theoretical high energy astrophysics. Is this correct? Okay, at the University of Amsterdam.
Get it specific.
Gotta get it specific, right? And Michael, you are the sort of general and scientific director of SRON in the Netherlands Institute of Space Research, correct?
That's right.
Among other things. So I don't want to limit that just to who you all are, but I just want folks to know who is in front of us. We have some of the brightest minds in the world, and I think we have some value to learn today and a lot of fantastic discussion. So first off, thank you all for joining us. My first question is, how much do you wish you were still in the United States right now with this leadership?
Yeah, that's a tricky one. We don't.
So maybe a bit of survivor's guilt.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, look, all joking aside, living abroad as Americans is always hard. You miss your country, you miss your family, but you also see it from a distance, and it's hard to like what you see right now.
Sure.
And I think it's a good time to, draw attention to the fact there's a lot of misinformation. And believe it or not, like paying your taxes gives you things, and we get great healthcare, and there's, a lot of great education, a lot of benefits that we really have come to enjoy living in Europe that I kind of wish would be extended to the US,
Yeah, oh yeah. And, my short time abroad, I've seen that. There was a point in time where, being American nationally had a different effect on the people you were interacting with. But now it feels like it's almost like a negative, almost.
It goes up and down. I lived in Germany under the Bush years, and that was a real up and down, right? Because it was kind of down. And then 9/11 happened. I was living in Germany when that happened. And then we went up for a bit because everyone felt really sympathetic.
Sure.
And kind of didn't do too well with using that sympathy. And we went down again.
Right.
Yeah. And then under Obama, we were doing very good internationally. Sure. I mean, the esteem that people have for the U.S. went way up, and now we're, so it kind of goes in this cycle. Yeah.
It's interesting. It's interesting when you think of it that way, and when you're confined really for whatever reason to just the United States, you don't get to have that rich perspective, which is super helpful. So let's jump right into it. So I did some research on just the nature of astrophysics, right? And the overall sciences in the US. And Kentucky is by and large nowhere to be found. So, and Minnesota does a little bit better, but it doesn't average as a whole in the top, right? So my first question is,
yeah.
They're really good at milk and butter technology.
So my first question is, seeing as how the two of you hail from each state respectively, tell us a little bit about your journey to the sciences, and in particular astrophysics, given your locale and how you came up.
You want to take that one first?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I mean, I think it was a little bit of a random walk. It wasn't a preordained thing by any means for me. I didn't grow up in a scientific family with a lot of exposure to that stuff. And it was really through sci-fi and comics. I mean, I get asked this all the time, and that's pretty much the answer, is that I got exposed to ideas about the universe and what's in it and all the cool possibilities out there that got me thinking. Mm-hmm. And I was actually really more of a creative. I was studying art, and I thought I was going to go to art school, but I was drawn to the sciences. I just didn't have like a model for how was that even a possibility? But I got kind of lucky in the sense that that I had done okay in like math and science, but mostly in this art program. So I sort of had my foot in two doors, and I finally just thought, well, I'll try to do science, and I can always go back to art. It's probably better to try to do that. And I took the leap, literally, really at the last minute, and just decided to try to study science, and then never thought I would finish, but it stuck, you know.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, and for me, I think there's similarities. I think the sci-fi comic book stuff when you're a kid, that definitely was a big theme for me. And I'm a little bit older than her, so I actually watched Man Walk on the Moon as a kid, right? And that was really really locked it in. So I mean, I wanted to be a scientist or an astronaut or something like that, even from a very early age. Of course, I didn't really know what that meant.
Sure.
But I think a big departure for me compared to Sarah is I grew up, I'm very much a gearhead. And like I grew up like, I was really impacted by my grandfather, who was an auto mechanic. And I spent a lot of time, working with him in his shop. And so like, the technology and the gear, the spaceships and that really, drew me in. So, I mean, doing the science, how we use those tools to do the science is something that I almost came to later,
Right.
But yeah, I've always been more on the sort of technical side. And so that, I mean, most of what I do these days is build telescopes.
Sure,
so.
sure. Now, I know for a fact, at least in my circles, that hard sciences in general, especially astro and physics, there's this perception that you have to, either you have it or you don't. Like you don't learn this down the road.
Yeah.
Dismantle that for me, or affirm it.
I totally disagree.
Yeah,
Okay.
Totally disagree.
Yeah.
That's good to know.
Well, I could say so many things about that. Look, some people are better at some things than others, right? But I've never considered myself like some super genius. I've never considered myself the smartest guy in the room. And I've accomplished the things I have, I think, just by trying to really being stubborn and working hard. But and I think anybody can be a scientist.
Sure.
Yeah. I have like a couple things to say about this, because I do a lot in terms of trying to change, the system from the inside in terms of increasing diversity. So I'm always thinking about this, right?
Right.
And there's so many levels that you can think about this on. There's the reason why kids don't find an interest in math and science and how they get turned off to it, because by nature, kids are scientists, right? Kids are curious and they're testing stuff out and they're really drawn to this. But there's so many messages that kids get from media, from society about what it is to be a scientist. And they're always showing some little, white guy in a lab coat. And it often seems like a lonely endeavor maybe, or, and that's just the complete opposite, right? So you have to work with kids to kind of change their attitudes and change the parents' attitudes about what this is all about. But then there's also no way to be, there isn't just one way to be a scientist, right? There's, like any career, there's a huge variety of skill sets and directions to go, and some are more technical and some are more theoretical. Some scientists,
absolutely.
Don't use math on a daily basis, so it's not like you have to be brilliant at math. A lot of scientists, don't use computers that much. I mean, so you find your way, and I think the only thing is you have to be curious. You have to be curiosity driven.
I mean, we're both astrophysicists,
right.
In some sort of vague general sense, but we could not be more different in terms of the things that we're kind of interested in and that we focus on in day to day. And yeah, I got to say, one of the things that this programming that she's talking about that kids get, it doesn't stop. It does. I mean, it goes all the way up to after you get your PhD and you become. I mean, there are still these sort of old tropes that people get handed about, what it means to be a scientist, what a scientist looks like, how they spend their time, and what constitutes being a good scientist. And it's all changing. Is the good side of that story. I mean, one of the things I love about the sort of current generation that's coming up is that they're throwing some of that stuff off, and they're like, no, I want to do this part of the time, but I want to do this the other part of the time. And I love to see that, because when I was coming up, it was like you did this and you did this and you did this. And if you didn't, you were a failure. And it's bullshit.
have you seen any of the talks by people like, I mean, Tana Joseph is a former student. Well, I mean, she's still doing astrophysics, but she's moving more into also communicating about science. And she's from South Africa originally, and she's a woman of color. And she's talking about, you know, how science kind of became the way it is and the scientific method. And it's part of this conversation about decolonizing science, right? That can mean a lot of different things. But it's something where once, you know, it's like you put, you know, you take the glasses off, you sort of see that it's everywhere, this programming. And it was really developed in, you know, the colonial period, the 1700s, and then really kind of codified in the 1800s.
Sure.
This idea that science as it is was set up by men of leisure, you know, wealthy upper class guys who lived in castles and had time and money to, you know, mess around with, you know, their labs, and just, it was like a hobby. And so there's this built-in attitude of like, you shouldn't be doing this for money. It should be the only thing you want to do with your life. You should be obsessed with it.
You should be willing to sacrifice anything for it.
Right, exactly. You can, because you don't really have to worry about other things like eating and money. You know, someone takes care of all that for you. And the sense of working by yourself a little bit, and you know, all of this is so built into the field.
And it's changed. I mean, it is changing. It's like now it's about collaboration. It's about teams. You know, and she's in a project with, I don't know, 300 some.
I mean, another project
scientists.
with 1,500. You know.
No. Gosh.
You know, that's a different way to do science, and that you didn't find even you know, a few decades ago. So
that's right. And that's the goal, to continue that evolution and keep expanding the field in that way. And hopefully we have some folks who have agency in terms of access to power and change, who are more open to that than not, so we can actually maybe see some real concrete changes in our lifetimes. And Sera, you started talking a little bit about DEI, so I kind of want to jump to you and ask you a specific question in terms of that. I can only imagine the journey for a woman going into the sciences, STEM, anywhere in this particular field. I'd be interested to know sort of what was, or what is your entry point in the work of DEI, specifically in the field of astro. You know, when did you maybe start picking it up? What activated you? Was it a personal experience? Things of that nature.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? Like, I think I was oblivious to a lot of stuff. I think coming into it, I just thought things were the way it was. I mean, I was obviously one of the few women. When I studied physics, I mean, I was one of 10%. And it's changed now that in the US, it's more like probably one of, I think it's like 30% now. It's gotten better at the bachelor's level, but it was about 10% where I was at. And then when I moved up the ladder, even to grad school, I was the only girl pretty much, you know, in this program. And I've always been used to that. So, you know, I didn't question it. I didn't think a lot about it. And I think that when you talk to a lot of people, you get to a certain age where you look back and you start to realize, like, oh, that was discrimination, or that was sexist, or whatever. And I didn't really twig to a lot of that as it was happening, except for a few very, very, you know, obvious cases that did happen. But most of the time it was just kind of like, do my thing. And then, you know, as I got higher up the ladder, you know, I started to see more of this unfairness and inequity. And it wasn't necessarily so much happening to me as just everything around me and thinking about it. And then the other thing is, I just believe in fairness, right? Like, I think as a scientist, I can see numbers, right? And if you compare the distribution of people out on the street to the distribution of people in science, it's radically different. And there's only two ways you can really explain that. One is the bad way, which is, you know, the narrative that certain people don't have what it takes. You will still hear people saying that, but that is really being phased out, you know, because I think there's nothing to support that. Right. And then there's the obviously there's something in the system. There's gatekeeping. There's all sorts of, you know, stuff going on that has to be changed. And so I don't know, like, I just started wherever I could, trying to, you know, I think one of the things you have to keep in mind is you can't change everything. You have to try to do stuff at the level that you have some access or power, right? So
that's right.
You know, trying to kind of, I can't think of the word now, but like, I'm a little bit of a like rabble rouser, you know, like trying to fight the system.
Right, right. So sitting with that really quickly, what, you know, so research shows that the sort of the whitest field, at least in the United States, is actually law.
Mm.
But
Wow, I didn't know.
yeah, yeah, interesting, right? But astronomy and physics isn't too far behind it. It's not number one, not quite
Mhm.
sure if it's number two, but it's, you know, it's worth the discussion. So,
Extremely, yeah.
so knowing this, right, and knowing you're that the rabble rouser type of person you are, and having this lens of oppression that sort of maybe guides your work in DEI, um, what is? Let me see. How have you found people to consider this discrepancy, and how have you found them to be when confronted with some of this urgency to maybe change as a field?
Well, I think the last few years has really opened things up. You know, the conversations are finally being had,
Hmm.
which for a long time they weren't. I have to preface this by saying, you know, of course, I've been in the Netherlands for 15 years,
Of course.
and the Netherlands are kind of like always about 5 to 10 years behind the US. I mean, it takes them in a lot of different ways, good or bad. But the discussion around diversity has been very challenging because the Dutch in particular, you know, consider themselves like really non-racist, culturally open people. That's kind of the propaganda as well.
Hmm.
And you know, they are in some ways
Yeah,
and
there's
not
some
in
truth to it,
others.
of course.
I mean, I always remind people apartheid's a Dutch word, right? I mean, that was from Afrikaans, which was a, you know,
Hmm.
the Afrikaners were Dutch colonists, you know,
Okay.
and so, you know, that setup of like, you know, we're cool, everything's equal. You can be an immigrant or black or whatever, but just do it over there. That really extends to the European way of like
Yes.
dealing with stuff. And so up to the level that Michael, you know, we'll talk about, I'm sure, next, about even like within policy and our national funding agency, I would say we need to start moving beyond the gender thing and start looking at, you know, race and social economic status and all this kind of stuff. And they would literally just say, well, we don't really understand this, so we're just going to stick with gender because we're kind of comfortable with talking about
Right.
that. And that was the thing that, you know, so first you pushed on gender for a while. And I think that's the same in the US, that it was a gender discussion, but it opened up here much earlier
Right.
to starting to talk about race. And so it really depends on where you are having this topic discussed. I think in the States, people really recognize that this is a big problem, and there's been a lot of actions and from the government level, you know, down to grassroots, there's a lot of stuff going on. And I've been mainly just trying to port stuff over,
Sure.
you know, best practice that I can port over and say, like, we can change it a little bit and apply it here, right?
Right.
But
Right. Yeah, and you make an interesting point about sort of the ways in which race discussions show up, or disparities versus gender, and that is a question I do have, and that I want to come back to because I want to hear both of your perspectives on it. But Michael, I do want to ask you a specific question. So there's a July 8th article, right, from space.com. Sort of that went on to say that, and I'll quote, systemic racism is wholly pervasive in astrophysics. And it goes on to say that, quote, we need white males to speak up and call out any lack of diversity or inclusion, end quote. Now, you and I have had off the cuff a sort of a very good conversation about workplace dynamics in terms of diversity and inclusion with respect to managing people. Given your position, how receptive have you found the field to be in terms of acknowledging and addressing some of these workplace disparities while tying in the policy concepts that Sera just mentioned?
Yeah, that's a tricky one to answer. I wouldn't say resistant.
Okay.
That might be too strong a word, but at the policy, at the higher levels, I think, you know, Sera put her finger on it, that they've been very focused on, again, and in my brain, I kind of want to make a distinction between what's going on in the field, what I see happening in the field in the US versus the Netherlands, because let's face it, it's very different. And,
That's right.
and the US is ahead of Europe in that sense. It's not resistance, it's a blind spot for them, I think, is the truth.
Gotcha.
So, and the initial reaction, you know, to having a blind spot pointed out is often like, confusion, or even, you know, if not outright rejection, then at least an initial recoil. And so I think over the years, as I've sort of assumed increasingly larger management roles and, you know, leadership roles, this comes on the table as it's part of the deal, right? This is what comes on your to-do list as somebody in one of those positions that you have to acknowledge, deal with, try to fix, etc. Whether you it's part of your sort of personal day-to-day agenda or not is secondary. And I've just seen that it's always on the list. These issues are always on the to-do list, even at the highest levels, but they're always at the bottom.
That's right.
Or they always get pushed off the. I mean, I literally, you know, I had very high, you know, management team meetings with other institute directors across the Netherlands, and we've got all this stuff that we need to get through. We meet every month. Diversity, equity, and inclusion is on the agenda every single month, and it almost never gets sufficient airtime. Right. There's always some crisis of it. And again, there's no ill intent.
That's right.
It's just not the priority.
It's just not the priority. It's just not the priority. And, you know, okay, some weeks something's on fire and you could say, yeah, okay, we really got to put that fire out. I mean, sometimes that's just the case.
Of course.
But 12 months out of 12, no. I don't, you know, there's something deeper at work.
So,
and frustration.
And so I want to piggyback off that a little bit, and maybe we can expand some. You mentioned that, you know, you may not label it as a level of resistance, and I understand where you're coming from with that. So what I've come to learn through my experience is just what you were saying. I tell people, if you want to show me your priorities, you show me your budget, right? And so then if diversity is not invested in, then I understand that it's not a huge priority. But there's also this element of fear that comes with the possibility of change. And so if we do focus our diversity efforts in this way on this or these particular groups, then a more critical way of examining it is then I have to vacate some of the privileges that I receive by keeping things the way they are. Michael, what has to happen, to the best of your ability, because I'm not expecting anybody to really have a solution, but from your seat at the table, how do you get some of these folks to understand their privileges as it relates to them being resistant or showing some hesitancy around prioritizing these topics?
Yeah, you know, I wish I had a glib answer for that, Shard. I really do.
Me too. So,
and you know, I mean, I look at this problem personally myself, right? It's like, you know, we've talked about this, you know, between the two of us before. It's like, I have a lot of privilege, right? I know that, I see that, I've learned to see that. And I can't give it away, right? I can't give it away. So all I can do is try to use it. And I see, you know, and not everybody has reached that point, right? So again, it's like you're sitting in a room with a bunch of people with a bunch of privilege. Some of them may know they have it, and some of them haven't even thought about it yet. Right. And even the ones who have thought about it don't know what to do with it. Right. And I'll put myself in, I mean, on any given day, knowing that I have all this privilege, I don't always know how to put it to use.
Sure.
So how to change that? I mean, I think it sounds simple, but you've got to bring everybody to the point where they know they have that privilege and they agree that they should use it for the, you know, you've got to learn to use your superpowers for good, right?
Yes.
And you know, it's really frustrating for me to sit in a room with a bunch of 50-plus-year-old white men who've had privilege all their lives and have just amassed more and more, and not see them reach that altruistic phase of their life, right? I mean, right. if they're a 20-year-old kid scrambling to make do and fight for a place in the field and all that, I'll cut them a lot of slack, right? Sure. But I'm sorry, you're now 50, 60 years old, you're at the top of your game, you're at the seat of power. It's like, if now's not the time to turn around and say, okay, now what can I do with this for others? Then there's a real problem in who we're selecting for power.
That's right.
Yeah. Can I?
Please.
I mean, I've been thinking about this a lot, right? Like, why is it, you know, there's this kind of, what you find that's happening a lot now with the diversity and equity. I mean, it's funny because every country has a different order they put it in. They call it EID and
EID, EDI, DEI. Yeah.
Yeah.
As long as they're all in there.
But it's like you've got to bootstrap. Everyone goes through this bootstrap phase. And what's happened, whether it's the US or whether it's Europe, you know, it's been first, you know, the women got their foot in the door.
Mm-hmm.
And because of the way that privilege is set up, you know, white women have privilege over women of color, but they don't have privilege compared to white men. So there's been, but I think that that means that there's more sense of giving back, right? Like, or more awareness of the problems. And so as women have come up the ladder, you start to see that, you know, we're making headway with the men. The departments that have more women tend to be better socialized and more aware and move forward faster on issues of equity. And now, you know, we're trying to get the door open to get people of other axes, you know, whether it's color or I think I like to separate socioeconomic status because that's a kind of a different thing and it crosses color lines as well.
Sure.
You know, and it's one I'm sensitive to because, like, you know, my family wasn't.
Same, certainly.
Yeah, so it's like, you know, so I'm more sensitive than you might think as a white woman, and Mike as well. You know, we're from more working classy kind of backgrounds. Like,
we don't take this stuff for granted.
Yeah, but you know, the point is that I think a lot of the classic white male scientists, going back to that kind of colonial model, it isn't in the model to try to make stuff better for other people.
Yeah,
right?
Can I just
Please
follow on my earlier point, and because I you know, listening to myself talk earlier, it sounded like I was trying to give these guys, you know, like a break, right? Because everybody's on an evolutionary path, which they are. But to be more practical about it, I think this stuff needs, I mean, at the policy level, part of the way we address it is you just make it part of the job. I mean, in writing and tie it to performance. So
that's right.
It's in the list when you're doing a job hire and you're selecting people for these kind of positions. It's like this is part of your job. There it is, right there, number 4.
Mm-hmm.
And then I'm going to come back to this list and to assess how you're doing and decide whether you keep your job and whatever. We literally just have to write it into the job. And then, if you don't like the way that job sounds because you don't want to do those things, well, then you're not suited for the position.
That's it.
Right? And that's a policy thing. That's
right.
That's just as practical and black and white as you can make it. No pun intended.
Yeah, and it also, I mean, you can do this at any level. You know, when we have our faculty hires, for instance, I mean, this is an important thing in my department, right? And so, for instance, when we're interviewing in the faculty, we ask about, you know, this, you know, what have you done lately for diversity? How are you a good citizen other than what you have to do for your job description? And it's really funny, actually, because this is not just something pushed by the women, but like, you know, since this has changed, kind of a sea change in the department, the younger men that we've hired also feel this way, and actually some of the older men, to be fair. But what I always find interesting is the reaction of some of the candidates who, again, like especially coming from Europe, are not as familiar with this conversation. This conversation hasn't happened as widespread. And when they're asked by another white man on the committee, what have you done lately about diversity? Or what would you do, since you're obviously not a diverse person, how would you help increase diversity? And there's just this stunned silence, you know, because they didn't even think they would be confronted with this. Whereas I think, at least from the US side, candidates are more versed, right, in these questions.
Right.
You know.
And it's interesting because, so I haven't actually been the director that long. You know, I took this position going on almost a little under 2 years ago.
Right.
But when I came in, one of the things that was put on my plate was to address gender diversity.
Yeah.
So it is actually written into my job description, and I am assessed on, you know, hey, Michael, how's that going? You know, are you showing improvement? Which is great. The point of that comment is that this is great because I have every mandate I could hope for to take action, physical, concrete action, put my money where my mouth is, and so on and so forth. But what's not written into the job description is a broader definition of diversity.
That's right.
So
that's right.
You know, there's progress to be made there, but
yes,
it's a step in the right direction.
Right, and those are all wonderful points, and it, you know, the heart of visceral change today, what we've evolved into is an organizational development sort of company consultancy that works exactly on that. The philosophy is that training and development workshops are part of the overall conversation. I mean, we can't really shift an entity if we're all believing very different things in terms of the path to diversity, equity, and inclusion. But the idea is just that, to how can we center your professional frameworks around diversity, equity, and inclusion, given everything you all just discussed and we all just talked about. So so with that, Sarah, I want to come back to you, and I want to ask, well, I want to acknowledge first that, last summer I got to partner with you, and it was a fantastic experience, period. Advancing Theoretical Astrophysics, it was a summer school. And it was my first time abroad, so I checked off a lot of firsts. I got my passport finally stamped for the first time. I had my wedding ring on for the first time. There's a lot of things. The confluence was perfect, and so I'm grateful for you. For those who don't know what it is, tell people a little bit. So it's a two-parter for you. Tell people a little bit about what that was, and then talk about why you thought a diversity component was so important to the program.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think I can answer that in one shot, right? Because I mean, it was from the start an idea that I wanted to, like you said, right? Science, and especially the hard sciences, it's like pretty bad in terms of diversity in all axes, but when it comes to race, it's even worse than gender. And it's also, like you said, I mean, at some point you just have to do something. And it does get tiring hearing people just going on and on about the problem without actually trying things out. And I tend to just prefer to try to do stuff or see how things work. And maybe it'll work, maybe it won't, but you try to figure out a path forward. So I had a grant, my research grant that I wrote. And in that grant, I actually said that I wanted to run a summer school program in my field, which is theoretical astrophysics. And now when you start to put words like theory in front of any kind of science, then you can just basically divide by 10 whatever diversity you have. Again, because of these stereotypes people have about theory means you have to, it's an inborn thing. You either have it or you don't, you gotta be, and that of course is crap, but this is it comes on both sides. There's gatekeeping and people self-select out, because they have, their imposter syndrome, or they feel like they're not smart enough. And so what I thought was I wanted to try to tackle the pipeline problem in my field. And I wanted to try to encourage a group of younger people, a diverse group of younger people, to stay in theory or consider theory. So we had a meeting actually with, now Enrico Ramirez Ruiz, and some other the usual suspects like Nicole Lloyd Ronning, and a bunch of us. We got together actually in Copenhagen to have a science meeting where we also wanted to talk about some diversity stuff as well. And it was really interesting because we said we kept it to a very kind of small and trusted group. And it was the first meeting that I've ever been at where we were really open about like diversity as well. And the idea was every person before they gave their science talk would also give a bit of their background, right? Like how they got to this point. And it was extremely emotional. I mean, people like cried during, we were all like joking about passing the toilet paper around, but the idea of crying at a science meeting in front of your peers or like being vulnerable was just shocking, right? I mean, even when I talk about it, it's just like, oh my God, It was really crazy, but it had a huge impact on the young people there, seeing all the senior people who they put up on a pedestal. It's like, be real. And also to each other, like, I mean, we discovered how many similarities we had, how many struggles, how many things. And so that was a really like transformative meeting, I think, for a lot of us. And we kind of created this group. And then the next step was like, let's do this summer school kind of thing. And I had already had that in my mind for years and had this budget. So that became the group that fed into being the teachers and the facilitators at the summer school. And then, and we're all in this kind of computational data science, theoretical astrophysics group. So that was the theme, the science theme. And it's very normal in our field to do these 2-week summer schools targeting usually students. But so we decided to pick students that were young enough, like they had to have a bachelor's degree in physics, because otherwise you can't really get too far with some of the material, but young enough to catch them, try to encourage them to stay in the field, maybe pursue a PhD, or get some slightly older students to just, create a network and stuff.
That's right.
And we had, and then I had enough budget. I went fundraising. Doing something like this is expensive, right?
Yeah.
Because if you really want to catch people from disadvantaged backgrounds as well, and I don't mean just underrepresented, but I mean, we were looking globally at, people in like war zones.
Yes.
You need to have money to fly them there. You need to put them up in the student dorms. You have to have food prepared, and the whole thing.
Right.
So I was really pleasantly surprised by how many people, how many groups, were willing to contribute on top of the grant, and we managed to get the budget together and bring people together. We had 50 spots, and we had over 250 applications, and our field is not that big. So the point is, right, if you could keep all those 50 young people in the field, that is a huge influx in my area. If you go to international astronomy conferences, there's maybe 5,000 people in the world at a certain professional level doing this stuff. So it's not insignificant.
And imagine if you could do it every year
Yeah.
instead of every 3 years.
Right.
Whatever.
Right. What if all 250 of the people that
Could have
applied could have come?
And
That's
if you just keep doing this, so it was a pilot, right?
Wow.
And then we wanted to try to mix the science topics with empowerment, diversity. That's where you came in, right? Because when you're bringing a group of people from all over the globe, you want to give them tools on, like, not just, in a negative way, but in a positive way, about like, you're going to encounter some issues, racism, discrimination, recognizing it, building empathy, because everybody in that group, as you saw, had really different backgrounds and experiences. And I have to say, it's been really amazing since, some of the students have now made it into PhD programs, or, they're finding their way in the world, but they stayed together as like a cohort. We created a group on Slack, they support each other.
Great.
And so we have to find models like this to just keep it going. The problem is it is expensive. So it comes back again to some government people have to put the money where their mouths are, and be committed to doing this stuff. But there are models that work, right?
Right. Yeah. No. And you said a lot of profound things there, and it was an experience for me. There were, I don't know how many countries represented, but there were a good amount of countries represented, and
like 25 or something.
25 or something like that, right? And
yeah.
For me, it was like, for me, realizing that, my philosophy is that social justice intersects with all that we do, and I'll take that with me to the grave. But when we talk about to what degree, right, that's what really backed me up, where, the person from this country is like, I hear you, but this isn't really applicable to us here. And this person like, same here. And I'm like, wow. So it gave me a new perspective that I carry into my work to this day. So it was a super humbling and enriching experience for me. You talked about the vulnerability, right? And I'll never forget this. It was the last workshop we had. I don't know who it was. I still see her in my head, but I don't know who she was. I don't have the name. We asked sort of why do we do these workshops? Why is this important? And she said, because before we're scientists, we're people. And that quote sits on my website to this day. Now it says before we're professionals, we're people, because I had opened it up, but it came from before we're scientists, we're people. And so you talked about the power of that vulnerability. The amazing thing, though, and here's another question I have for you, is that since leaving that academy, thanks to the Enricos and Nicoles, the Smadars, yourself, I've worked with this particular field more than any other field that I work with, period. And it's not even close, which I wasn't expecting. So both of you can answer if you'd like. What does this say about the nature of DEI in astrophysics that so many different organizations want to work with a diversity professional in one way or the other?
I'll let Mike keep.
Okay.
Yeah, well, of course, I want to say something nice about like our field, and that we're quick to change or quick to recognize
Star
the problem.
Trek.
And there's some truth to that. I mean, I think we are it's a creative field, and where you have to be sort of flexible because you have to solve problems on the fly and whatever. And I think that maybe that mindset makes people a little quicker to change. I don't know, but I think a big part of it is the incoming generation. They are different. They are different, and they're hitting walls, from the older generation, but it's not stopping them. And they are different, and they are taking a different approach to how they do science and how they do science with each other as a community. And they just don't accept it. They just don't accept this stuff. And I think it's really cool, actually.
Yeah, for sure.
So I don't know what the magic switch that flipped, but I definitely see a sea change in the old versus the new generation.
That's exciting.
Yeah, I was just thinking, I mean, it is, I honestly don't know. I do think there is some element of the fact that we are kind of the dreamers, maybe, in the field, that, a lot of us did come up on sci-fi and Star Trek. And don't forget, Star Trek was such an example of diversity propaganda.
Oh, yes.
It was always like the first Black woman, is
aliens.
Like, and
Right.
later they've expanded this now into like sexuality and diversity and gender, so they're always like pushing the threshold. And I think that that's a really cool thing to like open kids' minds and people's minds to this stuff. So you have a lot of that. Of course, there's just a lot of people who are the complete opposite of that, like in any field. But I think that it's a bit of that 100th monkey effect too, where enough people started talking about it, combined with the whole just societal awareness that this is an issue, that it sort of rolled over. But I have to say, as a caution, that this has brought a lot of what you're probably dealing with as well, of like, like, I love this term, I don't know who coined it, but virtue signaling. And I've never seen more of it than I have since George Floyd, right? And like the whole, and that can be harmful as well, right? Because everybody's waving a flag, but like, again, you have to come back to what are you actually doing about it, and not just,
Yeah, and I said I wanted to say something nice about our field and give them some credit, but I feel like I have to do the opposite as well, because it's great if you see change happening in astronomy and in astrophysics. I like to think that I do see change as well. But I also know that there are these really deeply ingrained mythologies that hold us back. So I mean, I don't think that there's anything special about our field in that sense. I feel like this is a change that's happening in society, thankfully.
Right.
And we're responding to it as a community, and maybe we could be responding faster if we weren't blinded by these ideas of the lone genius academic and the old guy in a lab and all that kind of crap we were talking about before.
That's right.
So I'm happy to see the change, and we got to give credit where credit is due, but I also don't think there's magic there. I feel like we're responding to a society change.
I mean, it pays to be critical. I mean, we have to be of the things we love, the things we like, the things we are a part of. I mean, James Baldwin said, that it's because he loved America, which why he reserved the right to criticize her. And we want to see these things get better. And the longer we continue to ignore maybe some of these happenstances, the more we become part of the problem and the perpetuation of that silence. So I appreciate you searching for the nice thing to say, and then the nice thing coming out critically. I mean, that's for me, that's flattering. You know what I mean? I want to bounce back to you, Michael, actually.
Yeah, sure.
So I found that sort of, is SRON the acronym, or is it SRON?
So I say SRON. It's an acronym, but it's a Dutch acronym. So if I set out the words in Dutch, it sound even weirder. So I usually just say SRON. SRON,
okay. So I found that SRON's mission is to, quote, to bring about breakthroughs in international space research. I like that. If I was overseeing your mission, I was going to work through that with you. I'd be like, okay, I like where this is headed. The extension of that quote, though, there is one that's found at the bottom of the website, and I'm not going to go too much into it because it has some decent length to it, but it affirms for me, and I'm guessing this mission existed before you. So it affirms for me that the mission was not necessarily written to center diversity and inclusion. And one thing we try to do when we create mission statements or help folks create mission statements is to find ways to use certain language that allows you to play with diversity and inclusion. And that extension doesn't afford that. But the statement by itself does, if we consider the state of space and astrophysics, this idea of breaking through, right, creating breakthroughs.
Yeah.
So I wonder, Michael, if you think that there are any unique ways to look at that particular mission statement in order to highlight the importance of diversity and inclusion.
So I actually love that mission statement because it is as vague as it can be.
That's right.
I mean, it's great, as you say. It's a great sort of high level, goal, but it's not specific. Which
Not
means,
specific, right?
Which means how we do that, how we achieve those breakthroughs, what it means, what a breakthrough means, is up to us. We get to bring that. That definition.
Exciting.
And one of the things I like about my job is that while I get to be director, and I only get to be director for a while, I have some say.
That's right.
That comes back to what we were saying. It's like you've got privilege. How do you use it? When do you get a chance to use it? Well, this is part of the attractive aspect of a job like this is
That's
that
right.
you get to say how we achieve breakthroughs and what it means for the field. And it's not just about a Nobel Prize or some other big very concrete award like that. It can be as simple as when I took over as director, we had this many diverse staff, and when I left, we had more. Right.
That's right.
So that's I mean that, and I don't think that's true just for my institute. I
Sure.
think that's true for the whole field.
That's right.
Just my focus is on our institute for the most part.
Right. So I want to fire a question back at the both of you as we begin to close out this interview. I just want to double back one more time with the sort of gender versus racial component. And, that was something that I learned when I was there in my various discussions with other figureheads and leaders in their own right. It seems to be this negotiation of a either or and not a both and. And so what that does is sort of compromises women of color specifically when we start talking about, well, the issue is a women's issue, not a race issue. But women of color fall into both categories if we consider intersectionality. I'd love to hear your perspectives, and this is just an open question, you could take it where you'd like, on sort of what this discussion means in the Netherlands when we start talking about race and its pushback with gender, we talk about gender and its pushback with race. Just it's open. I'm not guiding this particular question. I just want to know what does that mean for work, for life, for the balance, etc.
So what does it mean for?
What does it mean for the status of work and someone trying to apply for a job? What does it mean for the simple livelihood?
Intersectionality.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Oh, go ahead. I mean, yeah.
Yeah, I mean that's well, I mean, you put your finger on what it means is that it's a tougher row to hoe, as they would say, in Kentucky. And that, I mean, that's true in the Netherlands or the US, right? Intersectionality brings additional challenges, right? That's the reality of it. I try to be more positive about it in the sense that because you can get people, gender is sort of more on people's radar and they're thinking about that already. You can use that as leverage to try to open it up and bring, the intersectionality in, but it's not there yet.
Sure.
It's just not there yet. It's certainly not in the Netherlands. And that's literally a conversation that's happening now. Like, right. Oh, we need to be, I mean, 2 years ago when I started this job, it was, as I said, I walked in the door and, gender diversity was front and center on my to-do list. And 2 years later, now we're having a conversation about how do we open that up and how it's not just about women and whatever. So this is lagging behind the US, but it is happening. So
sure. Yes.
Put some positive spin on it, I guess. It's but there's a way to go.
Yeah. I mean, I think that intersectionality, and particularly for women of color. And I would also say, other intersections like, LGBTQ of color, or, anything where you're going to have like double or triple hits against you and discrimination,
Yes.
right? It's really shocking in Europe, right? I mean, and I guess the US has it as well, but in Europe, the statistics are so low in our field. We're talking about, that I can count on one hand the women of color in my field in the entire country, right? And that's why it shows how urgent it is to, bring up the numbers, but you have to do it at the same time that you manage to educate. The problem is, right, like if you bring people in and then they're treated terribly, that's not good for anybody, right? So it's like you have to have these parallel ways of tackling the problem, like getting more students of color, more women of color coming in. And in the Netherlands, of course, color means something different than it does in the US.
That's right.
Right? The color axis in the Netherlands tends to be, it's colonial, but you have people who are Black Caribbean, from slave descent from, Suriname, Curacao, Antilles, places like that. And then you have people from North Africa, more in Turkey, and Muslim.
That's right.
And then of course people who are Indian and mixed race and things like that. So it's really
a more diffuse target in a sense.
Yeah,
Sure.
it's a very, it's a really different. You're dealing with a very different cultures of color than you think about in the U.S. And that's why I'm saying, I try to look at what happens best practice in the States and like what can we port over, but we have to make it applicable to the particular cases there. And it is really difficult. And I think the best thing that we can do is try to train the top levels to see this as an important problem, to put money into the problem. And I'm just going to say, and this is my one grouse publicly, the Dutch government, the ministry right now is doing this big thing called the National Diversity Action Plan. And they've got like people from all over and all the different, stakeholders, and they're coming together and blah, blah. Ask me what the budget is.
What's the budget?
There's no budget. So it's like they're asking all of us to put our time in, to come up with a policy, to do whatever. And the argument when you say, but there's no budget, is like, oh, but if we come up with this policy, then we know what, but it really is backwards in my opinion. And I mean, I'll probably get in trouble for saying this out loud, but I think it needs to be said, right?
Well, I'll say it too. I mean, I sit in these conversations, senior management, and we talk about the plan, and we want to have a plan, and we want to agree on what to do, and that's fine. Policy is just a tool like anything else, but at the end of the day, you have to back it up. Action means resources, right? And I don't like to just boil it all down to money, but you have to put resources into these programs. And so I often, I don't want to talk about philosophy all the time. I want to talk about what are we going to do? What concrete things are we going to do? And how much can we spend on it? And, we can argue about whether it's too much or not enough, or it should be more next year or whatever, but let's, until it's more than zero, it's all just talk.
That's right.
And, and as long as we move beyond talk, I'm in. Right. And if you're just here to talk and make, pronouncements and what's the word you use? Virtue signaling, performative. If it's performative, I'm going to go find something concrete I can.
That's right. I'm not here to check the box, right?
But I think at the same time, like by trying to, especially like the stuff that we do with kids, at least by bringing up the pipeline, you've got to get the role models there.
But let me say something positive so that we're not just banging on the politicians. I do see movement, right? Like the programs that Sera has talked about, that she's been doing out of those are getting visibility, and there's conversation about these are the sort of things that we should do on a national scale. They have brought back, even just in the last year, because of some of the conversations that have been going on triggered a lot by some of the stuff going on in the US, certain funding instruments have been brought back, to target these migration background, as they're often referred to, people. So, change happens, man.
Yeah.
It can happen. So it's not all just people spinning their wheels and and talking, but God, sometimes I wish it would go faster.
Right.
Yeah.
For sure. Don't we all? It's we can talk about DEI in this field, astrophysics and the world, and in the Netherlands, all day. And I'm so happy that we were able to pull out some really rich dialogue in this. My last question for you all is, so you recognize where some of these disparities exist in the field. You've seen it firsthand, you've experienced it from various levels and various levels of intersectionality. So if you were to sort of write a letter, doesn't have to be in detail, to sort of the marginalized sort of astronomers and folks who want to work in physics who are coming up now, right? About what to expect or how to maybe trudge forward, what are some things you would say to them?
I actually struggle with this a lot in the sense that, some things that have been happening haven't been pretty in our field recently. I mean, there's the good and the bad. And, I also think, as Mike was saying, he's right, the younger generation, I mean, we like, this was like, the expectation was like, you give it all up, you take any crap that's handed to you because you want the dream of being a scientist, right? And that's crazy, right? You're a person, you should have a life outside work, you should have all this stuff. And it is changing, but I sometimes struggle with, like, do I tell people that it's still gonna be a struggle? And, do you wanna follow your dream? And I think it is not gonna be easy. It's not easy to become a scientist, no matter what color or gender you are.
Sure.
In the sense that, I mean, I should take away the word scientist and just say maybe like academic in some sense, because it is still, a kind of a lifestyle that, is basically based on some monastic idea in some sense, right? Of working in a very, specific direction. And your life opens up a lot once you get past, as you know yourself very soon, Gerard, PhD level. You got to get past, it's like you sort of got to get your creds, and then there's a lot of possibilities, but up to the point of getting your credits, just like it's sort of what I often use the sports analogy, which I know is kind of because it doesn't work for everybody, but it's like you don't go to train for the Olympics and think it's going to be easy. And in some sense, it's like, if you set a goal for yourself, there's going to be some level of challenge. And I try to tell people that challenge isn't always bad and stress isn't always bad. Right. It's how much challenge and how much stress. And you have to find these boundaries for yourself that it doesn't become unhealthy. That's right. But change and growth come with, discomfort, right? In a lot of different ways. And I think, there's things that like you're gonna face if you're a woman, if you're a person of color, if you're a woman of color, if you're LGBT of color, these are just undeniable. I think that the keeping your eye on the dream, right, and like thinking about the amazing things that you can do with your life, the creativity and the ability to change stuff and make the field better, is in itself like really fulfilling. So it's like you just have to put the time in. And there are going to be difficult times, I think, like, and for anybody, but maybe that is what gets us all through. Like, I mean, I know that's what's gotten me through, is like on my worst days, it is still thinking about like the cool stuff, right? Whether it's the science or the people. That's right. That keeps me wanting to do this. That's right.
Yeah, I'm not sure what to add to that. I mean,
I think we froze.
Are you still there, man?
I'm still here. Yeah, I can still hear you. I think I saw you froze on my end too.
Thought we
okay, there we go. We're good.
Oh, there it goes.
Oh,
yeah,
sorry, man.
Our internet like froze.
So we froze up there for a second. Yeah, I'm not sure what to add to Sarah's comment. I mean, and to be very blunt, I feel like in a way I'm the last person to give advice to somebody from more marginalized background. But so, I mean, the advice the thing I would say to them, I would say to anybody, which is that, it's It's not an easy road.
Sure.
You shouldn't expect it to be, but you shouldn't also expect it to be harder than it need be. I mean, you know, it's not supposed to be suffering, and you know, you're not, you know, this idea that you have to go through some hazing, academic hazing to read, you know, that's not what it's supposed to be. So don't accept that.
Right.
I would tell them to build their network of their peers, because nobody gets out, you know, of this stuff by themselves.
That's right.
You know, we got here through, you know, there's an army of people standing behind us that helped us along every step of the way.
That's right.
And you need to put that team together. And, you know, I stay in this field. I have stayed in this field because of the connections and the people I have and that I've picked up along the way.
That's right.
And you need that. So, you know, look for those allies. And I don't just mean, you know, in the diversity sense, I just mean look for your team.
Of course. Yes.
And actually, maybe just one other thing I would add that remind me that, I mean, I think one of the things that I've noticed as I've become more of a mentor, you know, as I've grown up, right, and start mentoring younger people, is that people who need mentoring the most are the ones least often to seek it out or ask for it, right? Because, you know, either you think you don't deserve it or somebody wouldn't give it to you. And I've seen this time and time again. And I think it's really important to seek out allies and recognize that, you know, senior people more often than not are of goodwill, you know, and if you have a bad experience, it doesn't mean it's all going to be bad, and you just find a better person to, you know, so it's really important to find the good people, because there are a lot of them out there.
There are people who want to help.
You know,
that's absolutely right. I mean, none of us got to where we are today by ourselves, and you know, I think there was.
Were white men. I mean, there were no women above me practically.
Sure.
So, you know, it doesn't have to be someone who looks like you even, right?
That's right. Yeah. Oh yeah. Certainly. You know, and you know, and that is something that we all have to own eventually and utilize as a strength and not a deficit. And so I'm really grateful for you all joining us on the chopping block and sharing your insights. Before I let you go, tell the people where they can get in touch with you, any social media, any podcasts, any blogs, anything, any publications where folks can get in touch with you and get a hold of you.
So I have a website. That's my research group website. So, I mean, I think you can get through to the University of Amsterdam, but if you just go to www.seramarkoff, my name is spelled funny, SERAMARKOFF.com. And the young people in my group blog on it. So, and then we usually put links to social media and so on. So, yeah. And
well, I don't have a personal website, but the Institute does, and you can find me there. You can find my email address on sron.nl. And I'm also on Twitter, so you can always, you know, fire off a DM or something. I'm WiseSpaceNL. But yeah.
I'm more of a social media Luddite, but I'm out there kind of.
Well, I don't tweet a lot, but I definitely scan it. I find it's a really interesting way to kind of see people at all different stages, you know, in the field. So that way I don't find myself only talking to a bunch of old white guys.
just keeping notifications on, I guess. Nothing else. Thank you all so much, ladies and gentlemen, friends, family. Sera Markoff, Michael Wise, Sherrod Robbins. You're on the chopping block at visceralchange.org.